Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to this week's edition of our morning briefing series on geopolitical challenges. We are live here every Thursday at 8:30 a.m. on Zoom and available on YouTube afterwards. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Director's Office here at DGAP, and it is my great pleasure and honor to be chairing this morning's briefing. Today, we will be talking about the EU and right-wing politics. Over the last 10 to 15 years, populist parties, especially those on the right, have significantly increased their vote shares across Europe. Consider the Sweden Democrats, Vox in Spain, or the AfD in Germany. In the European Parliament, the groups of Eurosceptic conservatives and right-wing nationalists have grown from less than 10% in the mid-2000s to well over 15% in the current parliament. And the election next year could further increase their share, thus stifling EU reform agenda, slowing the political progress in important fields such as climate and defense, and above all, increasing the divide in society. In fact, in her State of the Union address on Wednesday in the European Parliament, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen laid out an ambitious plan for EU enlargement without waiting for treaty change. And other pro-European voices are calling for more and faster integration. So how do we reconcile those two different trends? How do we deal with right-wing politics in the EU? And what are we to expect from the months ahead? To make sense of these questions, we are very fortunate to have an excellent panel today, starting with Hans Kundnani, who's a senior research fellow at Chatham House's Europe program and has been at the German Marshall Fund and at the European Council on Foreign Relations in the past. Hans has just published a new book called Euro-Whiteness, Culture, Empire and Race in the European Project, which has had some excellent reviews. So congrats and welcome, Hans.
Thank you very much. And thank you for hosting this webinar.
Next up will be Professor Nathalie Tocci, who is director of Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome and an acclaimed political scientist specializing in EU international affairs. In the past, she has, amongst other things, advised Federica Mogherini at the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also when she was the High Representative. Nathalie, you have published a recent article in The Guardian that I saw on how opposition to the green agenda is growing and what that might have to do with right-wing politics. So also very interesting. We're looking forward to your remarks. Welcome. And finally, but certainly not least, we have Milan, who is a senior research fellow at the Center for Order Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia here at DGAP. He's specializing in EU integration enlargement and Central and Eastern Europe in general, and has previously headed the Europe program at the Globsec Policy Institute in Bratislava, amongst other positions. He's also a dear colleague and a supporter of this morning briefing series. So it's great to have you, Milan.
Thank you. Good morning to all.
Before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. I'd like to remind you that this meeting is being recorded and will be uploaded subsequently. We will shortly kick off our conversation on the panel and then open up for questions after about 30 minutes. If you would like to ask a question, we encourage you to use the raise your hand button and actually ask the question in person, but you can also post it in the chat. Finally, just a word of thanks to my colleagues in the events and communications teams, and above all to you, our listeners in the audience, for joining us and for asking excellent questions later on. So now, let me hand over to you, Hans. Can you kick us off with your observations on right-wing politics in the EU, and perhaps also what you call the civilizational turn in the European project?
Yeah, thank you, Jan. And again, thank you for hosting this webinar. So on Sunday, Eric Zemmour, the French far-right leader, held a rally in the south of France along with Marion Maréchal. And on the podium, the lectern that they were speaking in front of, the slogan was "Défendre notre civilisation," defend our civilization. And, you know, that kind of civilizational thinking, sort of defensive civilization, this sense that European civilization is under threat and needs to be defended, I think is, it's clearly there in far right thinking. But I think that over the last, decade or so, I think it's gradually also been creeping into more sort of centrist and pro-European thinking into the EU itself. And that's really what I mean by the civilizational turn in the European project that I've been writing about for the last couple of years, and I talk about in my book. But in the last sort of few months, since I finished work on the book, actually, I've been thinking about sort of something even beyond that, which is this kind of idea that actually the far right could sort of almost take over the EU itself, which is something that, until recently would have seemed not just improbable, but in some ways sort of, impossible, a sort of contradiction in terms almost. And so what I'll try and just talk about in the next few minutes is why I think that is sort of possible. And then we can talk more in the discussion about whether that's really happening. And I think that basically the reason that seemed a sort of almost conceptual impossibility was two things, really. On the one hand, a certain kind of idealization of the EU, and on the other hand, a sort of simplification of the far right, which together I think made it seem as if the far right and the EU were sort of incompatible. And my argument is that actually they're not. They're compatible. So in terms of the EU itself, there's been this tendency, which I have to say is particularly strong in Germany, to sort of idealize the EU as a cosmopolitan project, as a sort of expression of cosmopolitanism. And one of the things I try to do in my book is to sort of show that there's a better way of thinking about the European Union and about European identity and so on, which is in terms of what I call regionalism, which is not the opposite of nationalism, which is how I think a lot of people want to think about the EU, but it's actually quite analogous to nationalism, except that it's on a larger continental scale. And what that means then, I think, is that if you can differentiate between different kinds of regionalism in the same way that you can differentiate between different kinds of nationalism. And in particular, I take the distinction that goes back to Hans Korn in 1944 between a sort of ethnic cultural nationalism and civic nationalism, and I try to apply that to regionalism. And then, as I say, it means that you can think about the possibility, which has clearly existed historically, of a sort of ethnic cultural idea of Europe. And my argument is that didn't just disappear after 1945, but that sort of persisted and actually informed the European project itself. And so, you can have something like ethno-regionalism in the same way that you can have ethno-nationalism. In other words, an ethnic cultural definition of Europe. So that's the EU, the sort of idealization of the EU. And then in terms of the far right, I think we've simplified the far right by thinking of them exclusively as being nationalists. Clearly there is a nationalist current in the far right in Europe, but that's not all they are. They're also civilizationalists. There's a sort of certain kind of tension in far right thinking, and there's a lot of really good academic research that shows this, on this sort of tension between nationalism and civilizationalism in the thinking of the far right. And what that means is that they don't only speak on behalf of the nation against Europe, they also speak on behalf of Europe in a way too. It's a different kind of idea of Europe. In particular, this idea of a civilizational Europe, and this idea of a European civilization that is threatened, as I suggested at the beginning with the Eric Zemmour slogan. And what I think's happened over the last sort of decade or so is that you've had this kind of convergence between the centre right and the far right, where the centre right has increasingly moved to the right on these questions around immigration and identity and Islam. And meanwhile, and this is, I think, the new development, or the newer development, the far right has started to sort of moderate in some very selective ways. And this is where Giorgia Meloni comes in, who I think is, really striking in the sense that, in contrast to, say, Viktor Orban, who had a very fractious relationship with the EU, she has a very harmonious relationship with the EU. And so I think what's happened is that, you see this with Meloni to some extent, I think also with Le Pen, that they've moderated in, as I say, in some very selective ways. And in particular, they've become a little bit less Eurosceptic. But I don't think they've moderated their far-right politics around these questions around immigration and identity in Islam. And so when Meloni became Italian Prime Minister, my impression, and this is what made me start to think about this, was that a lot of pro-Europeans, they were very worried about two things in particular. One was, what would Meloni do on the Eurozone? And the second was on, Russia and Ukraine. Would she be pro-Russia and not supportive enough of Ukraine? And as soon as she indicated that on those two areas, she would act responsibly, as it were, it seems to me that a lot of pro-Europeans actually no longer had a problem with her and could work with her to find, quote, European solutions. In fact, there was even this idea Manfred Weber seems to have pursued of bringing her into the EPP in the way that Viktor Orban also used to be in the EPP. And so I think that that illustrates, or at least it raises the question of what happens after the European Parliament elections next year. And I find myself asking the question now, based on this, the way that people responded to Giorgia Meloni, about whether a lot of pro-Europeans don't really have a problem with the far right as such. They just have a problem with Euroscepticism.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And as you're raising Giorgia Meloni in Italian politics, I think this is a perfect segue into, Nathalie, your opening remarks, please.
Well, thank you very much. And first, let me start off by saying that I really think that Hans's book is fantastic. I mean, there's a lot of it that I agree with. There's, some of it that I don't, but I think it has this, wonderful quality of kind of really making you feel uncomfortable. And it's really when you get out of that comfort zone that the light bulb, sort of lights up. So, so really, I do recommend to all of those that haven't read the book to go out and get it straight away. So let me perhaps kind of, relate back to some of the points that Hans was making, both related to the book and more broadly. Especially, so I'll start off with Meloni and perhaps then some broader reflections. And I guess, sort of I have a slightly less neat account than Hans does concerning where we stand. So firstly, I would say, sort of looking at it from the Italian standpoint, this to me is a story in terms of, if you like, electoral strength, not of the rise or the growth of the right, but rather the old traditional fracturing of the left. You kind of look at not only election results, but polls. And basically, if you do actually add liberal left and far left forces in Italy, they far outweigh the right. And the point is that they're divided and the right is not. And this is not just an Italian story. In a sense, the only the only exception that has managed to somehow cobble things together has been, the only two exceptions at the moment in many respects, are Spain and Germany. But sort of as we know, often the left has more problems in getting together than the right does. Second point, sort of I spent the first several months when Meloni came to power, sort of, reassuring, hey, this is not really what you imagine, right? This is not the fascist kind of old style fascism coming back to power. And I made the argument, which I still sort of, I think, but still believe is correct, that, Meloni is an ideologue. She's a nationalist. She is a Eurosceptic. That is not changing. That will not change. But, and this may sound contradictory, but actually it's not, she's also relatively pragmatic. She wants to sort of hang on to power, and she's not stupid, yeah? And therefore context matters. And therefore, to the extent that this was, and, sort of here I then come to the slightly more negative part of what I'm about to say, this was a context in which Europe was giving Italy a lot of money, in which we are in the midst of a war. It was still, energy crisis was still not over. In a sense, there were many constraining factors, which, sort of made an intelligent, quote unquote, nationalist and Eurosceptic behave. Now, coming to the slightly more negative part of what I'm about to say, I think that those contextual factors are actually shifting. in worrying ways as far as Italy is concerned. Recovery fund money, yes, we get it, but we can't spend it. And so in a sense, its value for Meloni is diminishing. Migration is rising, and the European solution, whether this is just sort of dishing out money to Sayed in Tunisia or relocation, it is not delivering. And we're back to numbers of 2016 basically. Yesterday in Lampedusa was the highest number, 7,000 people reached the island, far more than the population of the island itself. And this is basically beyond 2016 numbers. Stability and Growth Pact, probably, eventually there will be, I assume, an outcome, but it will not be what Italy would have liked to see. And then moving from the policies to the politics, as we head into European Parliament elections, Meloni has a nationalist populist opposition from within her own coalition, i.e. Matteo Salvini. So my argument is that actually this sort of weird Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde situation in which she behaves in Brussels, but she's her old self in Rome, will actually increasingly reconcile in the negative, meaning the nationalist Eurosceptic direction. So I'm not entirely convinced that this is a new brand, basically, of nationalism. I think it's the old brand, but simply it adapts to context unless you're completely stupid, frankly speaking, and kind of worryingly in many respects, she's not, right? Sort of looking at it, just kind of final couple of points, looking at it in a broader European direction, I guess related to that, the very first point that I made, in the same way as I'm not entirely convinced that there is a growth of the right in Europe, I don't think that there is going to be a significant growth of, in Italy, I don't think there's going to be a significant growth of the right in Europe. My bet is that actually, there's going to be the same old majority as always within the European Parliament. Yes, perhaps the Greens are going to go down a little bit, the Conservatives are going to go up. But you could have the ECR with Meloni saying, hey, I'm willing to support the majority, but it's kind of gratuitous help, right? No one really needs it. And so there's no reason why she should be getting something in return, especially as, point I was making earlier, she will become increasingly obnoxious in the coming months vis-a-vis Brussels. This has already started, right? Just in the last few days. Now, having said this, although there is going to be, I think, the same majority as more or less always, does it mean that one needs to sort of lower the guard and it's same as in the past? Well, no, obviously not. Just kind of three very, very brief points. The first, Jan, you were hinting at it. I think this green lash issue is real. And as Hans was suggesting, this is not just the far right. This is being imported within the center-right. So I think that is really something to look out for. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to go back and abandon the green agenda. It probably means that it's going to be reinterpreted, as it already is, in terms of industrial policy and a bit of protectionism. And so it's going to be, I think, discursively talked about in a different way, not necessarily abandoned altogether. Second point, I think that there is an enlargement story here, with an enlargement which is endorsed by these forces, and the strategic rationale is becoming, in a sense, imperative, but the transformative push within enlargement, democracy, human rights, all good things, and, sort of, this is a bit of a segue, I guess, into what Milan's going to say, is probably going to diminish. And third and very general point, and I think this relates to some of the broader points that Hans was making about how the EU itself, isn't necessarily anti-nationalist in the sense. I think this is really something to look out for. I mean, I think, Ukraine, in many respects, the war has resurrected, in a sense, the credibility of nationalism. So that we have been, in many respects, not necessarily born, but certainly raised in in an era in which, nationalism was just synonymous of kind of war and destruction and all bad things. And all of a sudden, Ukraine's nationalist resistance to Russia is a good thing, right? And so, in a sense, I think it sort of, back to Meloni. Why does Meloni sort of support Ukraine? I mean, beyond the fact that there's a certain convenience in doing so, because this is a nationalist struggle, right? Okay, it may be civic nationalism, but it's a nationalist struggle against an oppressor. And so I think there is this nationalism issue, which I think is kind of changing the way in which we understand it within the EU, and inevitably this has an impact on the European Union itself. And I'll stop there, Jan.
Thank you so much for this excellent overview, and thank you for complicating the picture and in the process raising a number of questions for the Q&A later on. But let's move on to Milan. And Milan, you're a specialist on Central and Eastern Europe, which is a crucial region for today's topic, I guess, especially with Poland's parliamentary elections coming up. What's your take? Why the surge in right-wing populism, and where are we heading?
Jan, so I will complicate the picture further, I'm afraid. And I will try to put this to get us back on the conversation about what impact this all could have on the future of the European Union project, as the EU will start a conversation about how to reform itself and adapt to strategically driven enlargement. And I think what we are talking about, this is the bottom line, is that it's increasingly difficult to even to rethink institutionalization of a politically divergent union. We will have more politically divergent union out of this. And European Union's ease is only part of a larger story. So my first argument would be that this is not only about right populism. What I see in the region that I'm, and actually my home country of Slovakia, which also has a pivotal elections coming in two weeks, radical populism is driven by the left. What happened to Robert Fico, 3-time prime minister that was resurrected after he was refused. He stepped down after anti-corruption mass protest. He was down to 6%. Now he's back at 20+%, and he might be the next prime minister of Slovakia. He has driven this, everything what Hans was saying, anti-Western, far-right sounding rhetorics. It was driven by him in an appeal to find new voters. So it's more complicated when you look at nuances. Anti-European radical populism can be linked also to what used to be mainstream left parties. And you have other examples, not only in Central Eastern Europe, where formerly social democratic parties, in an attempt to keep their voters and sort of outflank sometimes the far right, would shift their rhetorics and partly also their agenda there. You can also have a different impact of this kind of what we should not lose from our side is that something's happening in our societies that then sort of that defines politics, party competition in a different way than before. And yes, we are living in an era where in the US you have divided society, where Donald Trump could come back and where political conversation loses substance. It's all about sort of emotions and representing certain groups in societies that you just signal to them that you want to take some of their needs which were neglected and sort of challenge the established consensus or established elites, even though we are part of them. So ultimately, I will come back to a Meloni question for Robert Fico and other sort of leaders that are emerging in Central and Eastern Europe, which are for smaller countries. But my argument, my concern is that it will be much more difficult to actually contain them. If you look at Poland and other pivotal elections, there is a story of Confederacja. So far-right party that had surged to about 12 to 15%. Now they are down to 10% or lower in the latest polls. Also because both big parties, so Kaczynski's PiS and Tusk's opposition platform, simply shifted somehow towards their agenda and placed even some candidates, both of them actually. So you can talk about Confederacia's impact on Tusk. He preempted them, tried to steal their thunder. He put specifically in one district where Kaczynski runs on behalf of the opposition, a former far-right leader. You have Poland, the elections there is divided into 41 electoral districts. And this is in order to win the elections, right? So, and Confederacja story as a far-right party that is also very sort of that is libertarian. Part of the reasons that they surged was that they captured the protest vote against this duopoly of two strong parties. I can come back to the to the underlying reasons for some of them, but Hans, I believe that if it's more complex than just looking at it in the civilization terms. I think it's also about a lot of anger and resentment in our societies by also groups that are not only low income and working classes, but also increasingly divide between urban and rural areas. People who feel that are abandoned, that mainstream parties don't talk to them. And I think this is what helped to this revolt of Robert Fico, his resurrection, to come back. Basically, nobody was working with his voters or talking to them. So he came back and he used everything, including far right, or now certain sentiment of societies that the armed support to Ukraine went too far. And coming back, and this is what I will try to finish on, looking at Nathalie, your points that green lash issue is real. What I see in these two campaigns in Poland and Slovakia, there is some of it. There is some of criticism of a Green Deal as something imposed, which will have huge impact on Poland, where Poland is among the losers. You have some of it in Slovakia. One center-right party tried to run on this, and they are now changing their approach because it doesn't work. I mean, you can talk about cars and combustion engines going out by 2035, but it's too far. And also vis-a-vis these hugely emotional cultural issues. I think the story in Poland and Slovakia is that being pushed out by cultural issues or blatant, brutal nationalism, where PiS is trying to placate Donald Tusk as agent of Germany. I mean, they tried to placate him first as agent of Russia, and now he's completely like somebody who will implement German, not even European, German agenda in Poland. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing, enlargement story, endorsed under the strategic argument. But if we enlarge the EU, Central Eastern European cohesion funds with the newcomers, especially of Ukraine, so you will see backlash to it, and that backlash has already started, especially in Poland. There is a lot of bad blood now between Kiev and Warsaw on the grain export, Poland, and this is the logic of the governing party. I mean, it will be very, very, very narrowly, sort of very narrow result. So, of course, they stand fully behind the export ban on Ukraine grain, and this is they feel that Ukraine is now should understand this, and that Kiev is ungrateful. You have more of these dynamics, which shouldn't surprise us. And my time is out, so I don't have time to make an argument about Polish factor in the European Parliament elections, because there the EPP and ECR are actually split. Meloni's biggest ally in the ECR camp is Kaczynski's PiS, that are the biggest enemy of Donald Tusk, who is key. His votes of platform are key for the EPP to perform well in next June.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Milan. I think we'll definitely come back to this issue of how the various right-wing parties across Europe can work together and are working together, or whether there might be some divides there as well. as you are getting your questions ready in the audience, I'm just going to ask a quick follow-up question to Hans, I think. Looking into the multi-layered reasons for right-wing voting, isn't it striking that we see a fairly high amount of right-wing voting among the younger generation, where you might expect a more nuanced picture of what the European project is and of nationalism in general? So how do you explain this? And at the same time, just want to encourage our audience again to raise your hands and be ready after this question. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Jan. It's quite difficult to answer that question sort of briefly because, as I think Milan has already indicated, there's a lot of complexity in Europe, right? This looks different in different European countries, and in particular in terms of these sort of demographic or generational kind of divides. I think the picture looks very different. I don't think it is necessarily that surprising. I think part of the problem is that we've tended, I think, over the last decade or so, to look at our politics so much through the prism, I think, of American politics, Trump, basically, and think that the same thing is going on in Europe as is going on in the United States. And by the way, you could add Brexit into that as well, this kind of prism of Brexit and Trump. And there, in a way, that was the generational divide that you're talking about, Jan, was the case in with Brexit and Trump. But, in the case of, say, Le Pen, it's almost the other way around, right? Now, so it becomes quite difficult because it's so complex. I think I would also want to differentiate between different sets of issues because, I think on some issues, even among these so-called cultural issues, and, I think what Milan was drawing attention to is this tension in terms of explanations of the rise of populism between cultural and economic factors. But even among the cultural factors, I would want to differentiate between questions around immigration and so on the one hand, and some of these other issues around say gender, LGBT, and so on. And by the way, on those issues, there isn't a unified far right position at all across Europe. Particularly, there's a bit of a contrast between Western European far right parties and Central and Eastern European far right parties. And I think that precisely the reason that these questions around immigration and identity in Islam become something on which the far right, really mobilizes across Europe, transnationally, is because that's the one area that they actually agree on.
Thanks so much. I want to take up two questions in the chat. One of which is, I think, a bit of a conceptual question, asking to what extent the right is any more really the far right if it is moderating itself in the way that you describe, Hans. I think this one will be for you. And then there's a question from Bettina Buwisch, who asks what to do to defend democracy in the EU, take a clear position against or moderately integrating right-wing positions, and what can we really do to achieve this? What about support behind leading figures? Perhaps this is a question that you, Nathalie, want to take up. And I want to take a third question, collect more, and take a question from Philip Hirse-Mansell in the audience, please.
Hi, thanks. My name's Philip, and I'm a freelance author. And for full disclosure, I am also running for the Green Party for the European Parliament. But let's see on what place on the list, because that's still far away. So I guess I have a couple of questions there. So first, an observation. I mean, you're talking about the similarities between the US and Europe. And I guess, if you've been in Europe, if we look back at the history of Europe, then we've had a big trend of all major trends coming from the US to Europe with a delay of about 5 to 10 years and just maybe a small discount of about 30 or 40%, but that's generally been the case. And you already, Hans, I think you said highlight the similarities between Brexit and Trump. And I guess if you look at those elections, then the common headline, and I see that at least in Germany as well with the rise of the AfD, is more of a "can you hear us now" election. Yeah? So you have there's a social problem here where you have a large part of the population that justly or unjustly feels that they're being left behind. If you look at the demographic data, that's not necessarily true, but what is true is that at least in Western Europe, 30 years ago, if you were a simple worker, you could dream of, having your own house, having 2 cars, going on holiday twice. This is no longer the case if you do not have an inheritance. You do not have an inheritance, you cannot afford a flat in Berlin, even if you're an academic, right? So there is something there, and they're playing to it. On the other hand, to make my question more complicated, we have huge geopolitical factors. Milan mentioned sort of a backlash against the Green Deal. When I work in the energy transition space, the rise of electric vehicles in China is now the share of electric vehicles in China is now, I think, 40 or 45%, rising sharply. China is by far the biggest export market, not only for German but also for European cars. So if we are to survive economically, then there will be. It's not about pushing back. It's about sort of winning against China, and so. This is also the elephant in the room that's sort of missing from your conversation. So maybe all of you could elaborate a little on how you see China playing into this. I mean, we've had interference from Russian side, but China has very strategically through the Belt and Road Initiative sort of played the European countries off against each other. And of course, the far right is an ideal ally in this game. So, what are they doing? Because I mean, in a way, if you go back and look at the history books, then I see Europe as sort of a Renaissance Italy with all these principalities and big powers interfering from the outside if we don't get our act together. And then the one can be the Sienese and the other the Florentines, and you have nationalist sentiment start up. But at the end of the day, we're all losing. Sorry for being a bit long.
Thank you. 3 excellent questions. Why don't we go in reverse order? Milan, would you like to go first, then Nathalie, and then Hans?
Okay. Starting from the last point, Philip, on China, what I see China doing in some of the countries in the European Union is that they are increasingly learning to play domestic politics game, and they are doing it. If you said that European politics might be 5 years behind the US, I think China is a few years behind Russia, borrowing from it. So I see increasingly far-right parties at the reception at the Chinese embassies of these countries. I see Chinese ambassadors actually inviting leaders of some of the small parties in order to impact some legislation. I don't know how they will scheme the European Parliament, the next one, but they will play a much more prominent role than before. And you're right, we didn't discuss China, how China gets into it, but they will. And after the speech of von der Leyen yesterday, where we might have subsidies or investigation of China's electric car, they will have even a reason to do it. Now, yes, there is a contrast between far-right parties in Western and Eastern Europe. But what's also more complicated is, I think, we now in Poland and Slovakia, we have deeply divided, polarized sort of societies of camps of similar sort of, in terms of electoral result, it might be divided, and they're similar. So sometimes we make a mistake that we see Poland only as Kaczynski and PiS. We don't see the other part. And the problem of where far-right sort of comes into it, that it can be the third force entering. And for Tusk or Kaczynski, it's all about, they will have maybe a hang parliament, and they try to limit the influence of this Confederacja far-right party, so they have to attract their voters. And again, I'm coming back to what's happening among voters. If you say that, AfD coming back to Germany, many of these voters feel abandoned, I think it would be the worst. I think the worst intellectually, the worst approach would be to say that all sympathizers of AfD or voters are fascist. They're not. Somebody who is a voter of mainstream party, can be lost to attracted by AfD and vice versa. And this is where the challenge, I think, will be for European Parliament elections next year. We don't know what will be the issues, but part of them, as I'm signaling all the time, will be cultural. Gender issues are much more prominent in campaigns of Central Eastern European countries than green issues. And sometimes you can have within, and other thing is liberal defenders of liberal democracy versus the others. What defenders of liberal democracy in Poland have to cope with this brutal campaign. Sometimes you have no idea. You have maybe taste of it in Saxony or elsewhere, but it's defenders of liberal democracy and European project in country like my own Slovakia should be given a medal, all of them, because they are under constant pressure. They will have to come back next year to argue for your project to go forward. But we are Europe's East.
Thanks. On to you, Nathalie.
Okay, so the truth is, how should the EU be defending democracy? I mean, I must say, I think I changed my mind on this. Or rather, I think I've kind of probably gone the full circle, in the sense that sort of probably if you'd asked me the question a few years ago, I would have said, well, I'm all in favor of the political commission, and ultimately this is a way of kind of, sort of connecting more to citizens and all the rest of it. I'm not sure, actually, in retrospect, whether that is the right direction of travel, in the sense that I think there are some things that the EU can do and some things that the EU can't do. So the EU cannot ensure democracy. I mean, it's very clear. I mean, you just need to look at sort of, Hungary, Poland to make that sort of point in a very obvious way. So in a sense, the EU can only kind of put some guardrails on, in a sense, the conditions for democracy, rule of law related issues and all the rest of it. And, I mean, you can make the argument that in a sense, there is a learning process there, right? I mean, we were literally completely disarmed on that question, and some steps have been made, and yes, indeed, they're not sufficient to ensure democracy, to defend democracy, but they're better than nothing, right? But in a sense, in order to do that, then in a sense you need to go back to a technical set. I know Hans won't like this, which is why I'm saying this, but you need to, in a sense, go back to a more technical nature of institutions than the one that we've seen. So to Philip's point about sort of, well, obviously the growing disparities within countries, between countries, well, mainly within countries, as being sort of the fertile ground on which the right has resurged. I still think, and then that's obviously true, right? I mean, I still think it begs the question as to why is it that the right has, I mean, it's very clear that this has happened, and it's very clear that those disparities have grown, and then, you can interpret them in different ways and in different points in time and connected, in a sense, to different crises. So there's a slightly different spin to this, today compared to the Eurozone crisis, but it's in the case of the green lash, but it's kind of more of the same, right? But why is it that the right manages to capitalize on something which in principle is something that the left should be able to do? And I still think that we don't have a good answer to that question. In a sense, the right has managed to readapt itself, again, going back to where it originally came from, in a far more successful way than the left. Frankly speaking, the Cold War has been over for really quite some time. And so I appreciate the fact that the left, had a bit of an identity crisis since then, but surely, time has passed, right? And yet it hasn't really managed to find the winning formula yet. And I think, and none of us have, right? And I think it's interesting to at least ask ourselves, why is it that hasn't happened? And including on specific issues. Take on the question of migration. I've been having this conversation recently with the leader of the Democrat Party here in Italy, who's a good friend of mine, and in a sense, right? here is the proof of failure. You have an extreme right-wing government in Italy that has, sort of written on the sort of, migration issue as one of its main electoral, campaign points. Utter failure. I mean, utter failure if you just simply look at the numbers. So policies have not obviously delivered in any way. I mean, agreements with Tunisia are nowhere and all the rest of it. You can't do a naval blockade in the Mediterranean. I mean, all of the things that they've been talking about for years, obviously they haven't been able to do, and the numbers are rising. Okay, they've been a little bit unlucky, but never mind, right? And yet, no one talks about this even in terms of a crisis now, right? Of course, the right won't talk about it in terms of a crisis, because obviously that would be something, they would have done it had they been in opposition. They can't do it now that they're in government. But the left is unable to capitalize on this in any way. And I appreciate the point that obviously you don't want to capitalize on it purely opportunistically by making right-wing arguments. And yet, they're unable to capitalize on a failure of the government, right? And, we were both scratching ourselves in terms of how is it that we should, go about this. And we didn't come up with a good answer, frankly speaking.
On to you, Hans.
So let me try and respond to, give some answers that tie together a few of these things. So firstly, on these questions around economic and cultural questions and left and right and where the EU fits into that. And then I'll come secondly onto the China question. Actually, first of all, I should answer Stefan's point about the far right and it's if it's moderating, it's becoming more moderate. Can we still even call it the far right? That is very much, I think, the centre right argument. That the far right is becoming more moderate, and this is, and this was Weber's strategy also, I think, of trying to bring Meloni into the EPP is to kind of make them more moderate. My point was to say, so I think that's kind of that's sort of wrong in the sense that for me the key thing is the way, and I said this in my opening remarks, they're moderating in a very selective way, right? So I don't think they are becoming less far right; they're just becoming less Eurosceptic. And those two things aren't the same thing. And I think this is revealing, as I say, that for some centre-right pro-Europeans, they don't really have a problem with the far right. They have a problem with Euroscepticism. Okay, and then coming to these questions around, as I say, left, right, economic, cultural questions, and where the EU fits into this. So, Nathalie knows my views because she's read the book. So I don't think, as a lot of people think, that the problem here, in terms of the relationship between the EU and democracy, that the EU isn't doing enough to defend democracy. I think it's much worse than that. And you can, look at this as the views of a crazy, Eurosceptic Brit if you want. But I think that it's a much deeper problem, which is that EU constrains democracy. And in particular, and this brings me to the economic and cultural questions. And this is I'll try to answer your question, Nathalie, about why, because you're absolutely right. This is puzzle of why has the left not been able to capitalize on, growing economic inequality and, the rise of precarity and so on. I think that what's happened here is, and I think the EU here is an extreme case of what's happened everywhere in the world in the context of hyperglobalization, is that we've taken economic policy out of the space of democratic contestation. And so to put it bluntly, you can no longer pursue a left-wing economic policy in the context of the Eurozone. And if you take economic policy out of the space of democratic contestation, then your political debates shift to cultural questions. And the right wins on cultural questions. That's the terrain on which they want to fight. So for someone like me on the left, we want to have the fight about economic questions, but that's very, very difficult to do in the context of the EU and in particular in the context of the Eurozone. So, for example, I think one of the most important things that the EU could do to improve the quality of democracy would be to get rid of the fiscal rules tomorrow. Okay, now on China. This is another, we need a whole other hour on this, right? I'm quite hawkish on China. I absolutely see the threat from China, but I think we do need to be a little bit careful that we don't blame everything on China, and in particular that we don't scapegoat China for problems that we ourselves, and by that I mean the centrists, have caused. So in particular, I have to say I have very little sympathy for the German car industry right now. I mean, what happened here was that the German car industry doubled down on diesel even after the emissions scandal. And meanwhile, the Chinese, a long time ago, realized that electric cars were the future, and they had industrial policy, and so they're ahead on that. And so to blame it, talk about now, this is unfair competition. I don't really think that's what's happened. Apart from the fact that the whole context in which China has risen and its economy has grown has been a context that we've created. Again, this is back to hyperglobalization. And then finally on that, this idea, which Philip I think was kind of hinting at, and it's very pervasive in European foreign policy debates. We must unite to compete with China. I talk in my book about the whole history of this idea of geopolitical Europe, which goes back to the 1920s. And it was very much in the context of European decline. And in particular, at that time, after World War I, the perception that, nationalism was weakening European power in the world. And in particular, that it was essentially, preventing Europe from fulfilling its destiny to dominate the world at a time of European colonialism still, right? The pan-European movement, which was the inspiration for the post-war European project, was very much, as I say, all of the ideas that you have in the post-war European project are there in the 1920s. And it's very much, against the background of the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union at that time, and this sense that we have to unite to maintain our power, which illustrates, that the European project was always about power, not just about peace, as the kind of myth goes. And at that time, by the way, a key part of that was the idea of Africa as Europe's plantation. That was the language that was kind of used. This is the beginning of the idea of a geopolitical Europe. And so when I look at these debates now, I find it all quite troubling, I have to say.
Thanks, Hans. As you say, we would probably need another hour to discuss all this. Unfortunately, we only have about 7 minutes left. And I'll try to collect a few more questions from the chat. I think the question by Daniel Magrini on the relationship between China and defense of European civilization, rhetoric of right-wing politics, that has sort of been addressed by you just now. But there's another question by James Willie about the relationship between inept economic performance of the EU and the rise of the far right. Perhaps you could say something about this. There's a question for you, Milan, on the implications on the EU support for Kiev if Slovakia wins the parliamentary elections. And there's another question by James Willie: what does moderate really mean? Is a political party leader deemed to be moderate only if they are in EU enthusiasts? And then finally, let me take another question in the audience from Philip Heerser-Menzel, please.
Yeah, thanks. Just a very quick comeback follow-up for Hans. I mean, realistically, the fiscal rules, I oppose the fiscal rules as well, but they're not going anywhere. So the question is, but I would take issue with the fact that we cannot take have an activist economic policy. In a way, in the issues that you outlined, we can have an activist economic policy, especially an industrial policy, and of course we can have a much more activist social policy. So maybe I would just come back a little on that, and maybe we just have to think outside the box. Yes, it's hard, and yes, it's hard with a liberal German finance minister who's just sitting on the purse. But I mean, he's not going anywhere, so we need to think outside the box. So maybe some ideas on that thing.
Thank you for this follow-up question. Now we have about 5 minutes left, so I need you to be brief in your closing remarks. Let's go in the same order as in the beginning again. Hans starting, then Nathalie, and then Milan for your closing remarks.
I'll be very brief. So Philip, you can have an activist economic policy. What I'm very struck though by with Europe's response to Bidenomics is that Bidenomics is very much about trying to target the left behind. I don't see the European response being about that at all. It seems to be about, protecting big European companies from unfair competition. And so I don't think it's going to have, the same effect that Bidenomics might do in the United States. And then on this question from James about economic performance, the economic performance in the EU, of the EU, and the rise of the far right, I think we've been discussing this a little bit already. I think clearly there is a link there. I think, as I say, though, what tends to happen is that when it becomes quite difficult to do anything about that economic performance, the debate shifts to cultural questions, and that's what then means that the far right benefits rather than, say, the left.
Ashley.
So on this, I mean, actually, I'm going to sort of link up to what Hans just said. I mean, I think it's right to say that, in a sense, the EU, as, of course, the community had started well before, but in a sense, the EU as we know it, the EU of the single market onwards, was born and, in a sense, evolved within a broader context in which a particular ideology, i.e. neoliberalism, prevailed. And so, in a sense, it's kind of, in the DNA of the EU to kind of, be what it is. So I think in that respect, Hans has a point. Having said that, I think it's also true that obviously that context is now changing, which means that you have actors like the United States that can adapt with greater ease, beginning with the fact that they can just print money, right, to expand fiscal policy, and that the EU obviously is more constrained. Now, does it, though, mean that all is lost and the EU cannot adapt? I think it's unfair to reach them that conclusion. I think there is an element of adaptation. I think that although we obviously are not putting enough money behind it, there is an attempt to develop an industrial policy. So in a sense, you just listen to what von der Leyen was saying yesterday, and, the words are there. I mean, the point is that the money's not behind the words, and that requires a pretty fundamental reform of the EU. But I think ideologically...
This isn't a left approach, Nathalie, from Ursula von der Leyen.
Well, obviously not. I mean, she is a conservative leader. but in a sense, I think that's all the more striking. The fact that you have a conservative leader that talks about industrial policy and the need not to leave everyone behind and all the rest of it is, I think, speaks to the fact that there is an ideological shift going on and the search for instruments to respond to that. And as I said, because the EU is what it is, it will inevitably be much harder and much slower. But I think that there is, and there has been, a shift in the direction of travel, which I think is good news. And I'll probably stop there.
Over you.
Yeah, I think, Nathalie, your last point is crucial. The elephant in the room that we are not discussing is that how to operate such an EU that is challenged from so many directions, that is actually quite successful in adaptation, but also that will be sort of, I think the direction to go is more differentiation, and we are sort of discussing it quietly, but you cannot sort of keep the German approach to EU under Merkel, but also now was cohesion at all costs. So we try to sort of promote EU policies for all 27. I don't think this is possible anymore. Not only because of Viktor Orban, who will stay in Hungary, he now says until the 2035, but I think also because our politics in member states are become increasingly divisive, fragmented. We haven't mentioned Dutch elections that are coming, where Farmers Party, can finish on the first place that was not there just a few months ago. So domestic politics is increasingly volatile. And to answer Boris's question, you might see a paradox next year that the Ukraine EU path will be more challenged from Poland and eastern member states than so far, and Slovakia also.
Thanks so much, Milan, and thanks so much to all of our speakers. We've rarely had a morning briefing with such a lot of conceptual clarity and need for historical embeddedness. There's a lot to discuss. Unfortunately, our time is up for today. Thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us. do follow us on social media and watch this morning briefing again on YouTube shortly, and come again next week for our next morning briefing. Thank you very much and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.